and welcome to the St. Augustine Historical Society Speaker Series. My name is Margot Pope, and I'm on the Board of Trustees of the Historical Society. And tonight we welcome back our former Executive Director, Dr. Susan Richburg Parker, and many of you probably know her more because of her column, her weekly history column in the St. Augustine Record. But if you want to know any more about Susan growing up here, I will be glad to assist you. And I also know a lot more about drama in the 20th century and forward in the South End, south of St. Francis Street. And I can remember growing up, me and my friends from that part of town would find a way to get in free to the oldest house all the time. And what we loved most about it were all the women in the very glossy Spanish dress that obviously was never worn in St. Augustine by any of the colonists, but we loved it anyway. We particularly loved the mantillas and the high tortoiseshell combs. But tonight we are here to talk about the drama in the 1700s. And a little bit about Susan. I will not read her 9-page CV, but if any of you would like to read it, I will put it on the table out there. Susan holds a PhD and MA in colonial history from the University of Florida and a BA in Spanish from Florida State University. Thank you, Susan, for attending both of our premier state universities. She has taught at the University of Florida, the University of South Florida, and the University of North Florida. She was the executive director of the Historical Society and previously served as a historian and later a preservation consultant with the Department of State. At the local level, she recently wrote the text for 3 walking tours of St. Augustine sponsored by the Florida Humanities Council. And there is an app for that, and if you Google Florida Humanities Council app on St. Augustine, they will take you to the Florida stories. In addition, she had South of the Plaza was one of her writings, and the Gilded Age St. Augustine and the Civil Rights Movement in St. Augustine. Those are the 3 Humanities Council story tours that Susan has created for them. Her chapter chief, Francisco Joseph Q. Is that right? Okay, thank you. Okay. Reconstructing the path of a Guali Indian family through Spanish records is currently in process with the University of Nebraska Press for a multi-author book about the Yamassees and related North American groups in the Southeast. 2 recent publications by Susan are pertinent commentaries on life in St. Augustine, Reclaiming Homes and Lands in Florida, Private Property and International Treaties, 1763-1821, in Tulane European and Civil Law Forum, 2017, and particularly In My Mother's House, Female Property Ownership in Spanish Florida, in Signpost, Southern Women's Legal History, published by the University of Georgia in 2013. She is writing a book about triracial Spanish Florida for Oxford University Press. And there's a lot more here that I can tell you about her, but I think that you want to hear from Susan, not me, so we'll let her get started and take us back in time to the drama in 1700s. Thank you.
Thank you, Margo. There are also a few other people in the audience who know about me when I was younger, and so I hope that they are as considerate as Margo is.
actually went right to it.
About not talking about me when I was a silly teenager. Anyway, I'm very, very pleased to be here tonight. Before I get on this topic, I think most of us know, but I think I will go ahead, especially as a historian, and remind you that, of course, tonight is the 50th anniversary of the shooting of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And for those of us that are old enough, I bet most of you remember where you were when you heard it. It is one of those events that you know where you heard the news, just like when you heard that John F. Kennedy was killed, and or the space shuttle, excuse me, the Challenger explosion, and a few other things like that. There's moments that seem to rid of us, and certainly the killing of Dr. Martin Luther King, I think, was one of those. However, I'm going to move on to, because it's what I'm supposed to do, to the topic for this evening. I do want to welcome you. I'm very pleased to be here, and I'm very pleased, as always, that Flagler College permits us to use this facility. As Margot said, I was the executive director of the St. Augustine Historical Society for almost 10 years, and I can tell you that not just the Historical Society, but a number of cultural organizations in St. Augustine could not afford to have good meeting space without Flagler College letting us have it, brought us and providing it, because we looked around from time to time for other meeting space, and it could get pretty pricey if you wanted space for more than, say, 20 people or something like that. So Flagler is always very gracious to let us be here. You will see that I have here, I think, how many of you know where the oldest house is, or the St. Augustine Historical Society? Well, I thought most of you did, but I thought there might be someone in the room who didn't. And so I'm going to talk about what happened across the street from the oldest house and the Tovar House, those two buildings that are owned by the Historical Society, the drama. And that actually was a foil to get you all here for me to talk about what I really want to talk about. And that is the research that was done recently on the investigations at the Tovar House. But I think sometimes when we do these investigations, and we all want to be very erudite and talk about our research, but sometimes it's nice to sort of talk about the people that were there doing ordinary things, or maybe doing ordinary things for them, but maybe weren't so ordinary for us, or aren't so ordinary for us. So this is the location of the St. Augustine Historical Society, as you know. There is a painting of it done in the 1890s. The laser pointer just will not work, even with new batteries, so I'm going to use the analog pointer. And you will probably recognize the oldest house and Tovar House. This is a painting by Felix de Crano that was done, like I said, in the 1890s. And which I always like to show, because we have some nice paintings. There's the oldest house, and the Tovar House today. And this year, the St. Augustine Historical Society is celebrating its 100th anniversary of purchasing the oldest house and the Tovar House and all the other lovely properties that are down there. I've always liked this photo. Let me go back one. Because they purchased the building in October of 1918, or the two buildings, excuse me, on the grounds, in October of 1918, just before the end of World War I. And this is the executive committee of the St. Augustine, no, I'm not kidding, it is the executive committee of the St. Augustine Historical Society setting out on an excursion down to the oldest house to take possession. So there they are in their convertible next to the city gate, and they are going to drive down those 3 or 4 St. Augustine size blocks to take possession of the buildings, and have their photos taken out front. And so this is, we're now 100 years ownership of that. A few more photos there of some hand-tinted postcards of the Tovar and the Gonzalez Alvarez house. And I'm going to be talking about something that happened there about 200 years before we bought the house. Excuse me, go back. As you all know where, as I said, you all know where the two buildings are. And this building, this map will show you, this Eligio de la Puente map. These are the St. Augustine Historical Society buildings. And in the 1700s, of course, it was at the far south end of town. So it was really at the limits of the town. with the Franciscan Friary or Franciscan Monastery across the street. Now, in 2014, 15, and 16, I believe those are the correct years, the St. Augustine Historical Society received a succession of grants from through the historic St. Augustine Research Institute, the St. Augustine Foundation. Research Institute is affiliated with the University of Florida and with Flagler College for us to do research specifically on the Tovar House, the one at the corner of St. Francis and Charlotte Streets. And if you don't believe it's at the corner, you can tell that by looking at it. All you have to do is stand inside downstairs and watch the tour trains make that turn and hope they don't hit the building. And we've done that many, many times. It's a very tight turn. It was a wonderful research project. We just kept building upon it, and it was, I think, for researchers, it was just the ideal situation because we didn't have any plans for the building specifically that we had to keep to a timeline. So we could follow our nose, you might say, or follow our research nose, and be just as thorough as we wish to be. And I think we were, don't you, Kathy? Say yes?
Yes.
Okay, so and of course, how many of you were here about 2 weeks ago, I think, for Kathleen Deegan's talk about the archaeology? I know a number of you were. It takes too many hands to do this. So there we are at the beginning of the 2015 investigations. The first year we really it was paint analysis and some work by Herschel Shepard, so it wasn't as invasive as archaeology. And myself, Kathleen Deegan, and Herschel Shepard were the ones who had the grant. There we are standing next to the Tovar House, putting the first spade in the ground. And here we are in Charlotte Street. Kathy showed us slides very similar to this 2 weeks ago, where after we worked inside the Tovar House, we wanted to see what we could see right outside the building. After we bored through the floor and cut some excavation pits there, then Carl Halbert, then with the city archaeology department, came along and we cut this piece into Charlotte Street. They were doing some other work on Charlotte Street. Kathy Deegan here at the front, Dr. Greg Smith, who was the crew chief, and I think that's Carl there on the left. There's just a little piece of him there. So, and this, if you were here, you know that we dug inside the Tovar House. Although I'll be talking about both houses tonight. We dug inside the Tovar House, and while we were excavating, my granddaughters were here. I'm shameless about my granddaughters, and I took them down to the Tovar House, and Greg Smith put them in the pit so they could have their photo taken. Now, it was kind of a funny story. As we were getting ready to leave the house that morning, the older one on the right, Amelia, said, "Oh, wait. She goes back, she comes back out. She's put a bandana on her head. And she says, archaeologists wear bandanas." Well, I don't think she ever saw this book, but she isn't wrong. The all-girl trial team led by Dr. Kathleen Deegan, and I see some bandanas there. So I think those girls knew what they were talking about. They came down and had fun, and Kathy worked with them a little on the screens. Besides the fact of me being egregiously shameless about showing their photo, I also included it because I am going to be talking a bit about some of the children that were about the age of those girls when they lived in the house, and the stories that I'm going to tell of the drama that they might have seen. So you might think about those little girls and little girls about the same age looking out the windows. And I think the other interesting thing is that when they're standing in that pit, they're probably standing just about at the same ground level that the girls would have been standing in the 1700s, with the stories I'm going to tell at first. Okay, so I want you to imagine that perhaps some of you it's going to be hard, but you're a little girl, and it's in the middle of the night. You're in what we call the oldest house. Your name is Maria Francisca Gonzalez, and you hear a sound in the street. It's hot, it's August, it's humid, They didn't have air conditioning, but since we had Irma a few months ago, we all know what it's like to sleep without air conditioning when it's hot and humid, and they did it every night. So the window, the shutter, the wooden shutter would have been open, and she could have seen out the window. She got up to look out the window across St. Francis Street at the Franciscan Monastery, or the convento. And this is a conjectural drawing by Elspeth Love Gordon as to what the convent probably looked like at about that time. She knew what she expected to see, and it would be nothing new. Still, you could not be too cautious. After all, she was 10, and she also knew there were stories about how pirates had creeped into the city one night and literally caught everybody asleep in their beds. So she entertained the notion that she might actually see some pirates sneaking in and alert the city and save it. But the scene before her eyes, as I said, did not surprise her. She watched someone leave a small bundle at the door of the Franciscan monastery across the street. Remember that time, it's the middle of the night, she listened for small sounds from the package. She hoped that she could hear even the tiniest sound from the package. For the package was yet another newborn left at the steps of the monastery for the friars to care for. The reason, of course, she wanted to hear was the smallest sound was because then she knew that the baby was alive. Because very often the babies that were left at the door were either stillborn or they had died soon after birth, and they were left there for the fathers to bury. The fathers would of course immediately care for the infant and probably try to find someone to take care of it. The Franciscans and St. Augustine were not focused on dealing with orphans, and so they really weren't set up to do that as some other orders were. There was a reason. She knew that the mother couldn't care for the infant, probably society's disapproval of the situation she was even having a child, and that the mother was not wed to the father. We don't know if the monastery, the Franciscan monastery in St. Augustine, had what they called a wheel at the door. A wheel was kind of like a lazy Susan, where you could put the baby on one side and then turn it. And they couldn't see who was leaving the door. There's a description of that of one of the monasteries in Cuba, but they were an order that did take care of orphans. So this is the sort of drama, as I said, that she might have seen. I think it's drama out of the window. Now, of course, Maria Francisca's a little girl, and she would get up because she would need to tell her cousin, her second cousin, Manuela Tovar, who lived in the Tovar house on one side, and her other cousin, Luisa Gonzalez, who lived on the other side of them. They were both older, and they knew more about these sorts of things. We do not know too much about the house that was on the east side of the oldest house, but there was a house there as well, and one of her cousins lived in that. Now, she also knew, because little girls at that time were pretty smart, that there were several ways to resolve this issue about having a baby without a father. You could get married if that were possible, and she knew that her own mother had married her father 5 months before she was born, and that her cousin had married her father. Excuse me, her cousin's mother had married her father 5 months before she was born. I will tell you, from looking a lot in the parish records, there are a lot of 5-month first babies. I don't think that's too surprising, but I think they reached a point probably where it's like, okay, they've gotten past what now we would call the first 3 trimesters, and it looks like this person's really going to have a baby, and we need to resolve this. But now there are other dramas across the street from the Tovar and the Gonzalez's house, which were out in the open for all to see. This one, of course, was in the nighttime. There were funeral processions that came from the church on St. George Street to inter the deceased in the convent, or convento in the monastery, because a number of people wanted, especially members of the Order of St. Francis, wanted to be buried at the monastery. It was a higher status place to be buried, and those of you may or may not know that there is a status as to where you're buried as to how important you are, as well as other things. Francisca's grandmother had told her about the day that she was watching a funeral procession when Friar Arguelles stopped the priest and the processional cross from coming into the convent with the body. There was a lot of upset. A few days later, there was another showdown brewing when Juana de Avila had died and was to be buried in the monastery. This time the priest wasn't going to be caught short, and blockaded from going in the door. So he locked the body in the church and decided what he needed to do about it. The governor interfered because the body started to decompose. And the friars said, okay, we won't stop them, we'll let them come on in and do the burial ceremony like they've done so many times in the past. However, when they got to the front door, the friars didn't keep their word, and there was a showdown at the door. The priest couldn't come in, the crucifer couldn't come in, and there was all sorts of, I'm going to write the king and all this. And Francisca's mother told her about this going on across the street. Yeah, it would seem like living across the street from the monastery would be a very quiet, contemplative place to live, but apparently that wasn't always true at the Franciscan monastery. And then there were the regular comings and goings as well. Certainly before 1700, when the missions were still active, the Indians were coming and going from the missions all the time, and many of them coming to the monastery to talk to or meet with the friars. And then I'm going to go tell you about the last drama. Francisca might have witnessed the biggest drama of them all in March of 1737, when the families that lived in the Tovar and the two Gonzales houses watched 24 grenadiers, soldiers, surround the convent to prevent the escape of the governor who had run into the convent for sanctuary. Governor Morral had fled to the convent for sanctuary when his replacement had come from Cuba to put him under some sort of arrest. He was going to put him under house arrest, then he was going to send him to Anastasia Island, I guess with the idea that he couldn't swim back for arrest. He was ultimately to be sent to Havana because there had been many complaints made against him for black market dealing and for all sorts of things. So Governor Morral ran to the convent to give him some time to make his plans and ask for sanctuary. And the Franciscans refused to turn Governor Morral over to the interim governor, and they threatened to report to Spain that if the interim governor violated the sanctuary of the convent, they would make sure that the king heard about it. The king heard about a lot of things, but they thought so. Ultimately, the bishop that was in town arrived to negotiate the situation to avoid a civil religious conflict. Governor Morral emerged and was sent out of Florida, was sent on to Havana, and ultimately he wasn't found guilty of anything, but that took about 12 years to happen. So anyways, I said, this is some of the drama that went on across the street from the houses that still stand. As I said, who would expect living across the street from the Franciscan monastery would be in a front row seat for drama? We would expect it to be quiet. But now we want to move our attention across the street to the houses where these people were watching things happen. One of the things we want to do is find out who might have lived there over the years. And in St. Augustine, when we're dealing with the First Spanish period, you might say we begin at the end. I'm going to go through some of the documentary sources here that I use to do this. When I say we begin at the end, we begin with the map by Juan José Eligio de la Puente, made in 1764. And I'll show you a picture of it in a minute. On there, there are names of the owners, or the people that had fought with the owners, and the dimensions of the lots. Eligio de la Puente made the map just as the Spanish in St. Augustine were departing for Cuba when Great Britain was taking over. His map is dated January 22, 1764, the date that the last ship sailed. I'm not sure he was on it, but the last people sailed. And so he was under a crunch. As I use it, I wonder how, I don't want to say he's inaccurate, but how much information he had to work with, as some of the people already left. So we do have, whenever we use documents, we have to take into consideration what is the context in which they were made, and therefore what might be the limitations as to what they can tell us. Not that they're wrong, but perhaps they're not as fully filled out as they could be. The next thing I would look at is the parish records. St. Augustine's parish registers, which are conserved at the Diocesan Archive on Amelie Street. They are the oldest records of American origin in the United States. And we have a good run of marriages from can you all see the numbers? Okay. From 1594 to 1764, except for just a 5-year period in the 1630s. So we've got a good number there. But then the baptisms and the burials, we've got some missing books and some big long times that are missing. You can see that the baptisms, go up to 1638, and then the next 40 years are missing. And then they go to the end. And then the burials have almost 80 years missing in there. I don't know why, I can't tell you why. Also of interest, I think, here in the parentheses is that in 1735, not just in St. Augustine, in many places, there were separate books created for the non-whites in St. Augustine, the Pardos and the Indians, people with mixed bloods. And they run all the way till they left as well. If you'll notice, I said that we have parish records from 1594 to 1764 plus. I put the plus there because there aren't many entries, but after they went to Cuba, and a number of years after they were in Cuba, there were entries made about people who were in Cuba. Whether they went back and they thought their baptism, there was a mission or something, but there are some dates in there after the records were taken to Cuba. There's very few, and they're at the very end of them. So I would look at those. It's important to know when the burials are missing, because as I start to look to see who may have lived in any of these buildings, it's confusing sometimes, because if someone dies, very often they name the next child born after the person that dies, especially if it's a child. Without the burial records, we don't know, for example, if someone lived 5 years, whether they lived 50 years, depending on what the time is. We don't know, for example, that if we have a number of children listed, which we do for the Gonzalez family and for the Tovar family, how many of those children lived to be adults? It would be very typical for a number of them not to live to be adults, so those missing documents do present a problem. Fortunately, though, the marriage records, as I show up there, are the ones that we have the most of. And that's good, because the marriage records have the most information out of all of them. The marriage records are very good vital statistic records. They will give the name of the bride and the groom, if you get the really good records. Now, sometimes the priest is really in a hurry, he doesn't write much. But, and the name of the mother and the father of the groom, the name of the mother and the father of the bride, where the groom is from, where the bride is from, and then if they were widow or widowed, because they want to clarify that they're free to marry again. And then there's also sometimes marginal notes when, because especially among St. Augustine's higher status people, they tended to intermarry more than the lower people did, lower status people. And so they'll have a note off to the side that sounds almost like a chemistry or mathematical formula. They received a dispensation because they are related on his father's side by the 3rd degree and on his mother's side by the 4th degree. And they got the dispensation, but they have to record all that, and so that's all interesting information. Further down, as you can see, the muster rolls. Those are the obviously the attendance sheet of the men that are on duty, and that can vary too, from just a list that they were here to perhaps and present that day, or it may give their rank, their particular assignment, perhaps how long they've been enlisted. So the records, are not consistent over a long period of time. And if you look at our records, even today, most of them are not consistent over a long period of time for a number of reasons. And then down at the bottom, some that I also use, and they are in order of how valuable they usually are, or the order in which I consult them. The claims for town lots, which are part of the Spanish land grants in the Department of Archives in Tallahassee. The claims for town lots are those claims made by people or family members who returned from Cuba when Florida and St. Augustine became Spanish again, and they hoped to get their property back. And so they would bring copies of deeds if they had them, they'd bring certified copies of deeds. Or if they didn't have the deed, maybe it wasn't in the notary book or they had lost it, they would come back with affidavits by witnesses that had gone to Cuba with them, who said, oh yes, I used to live next door to Jose, and I remember he had a small balcony on the back side of his house, and he planted melons, and I used to watch his children, and he needed to repair his fence, or something like that. In other words, they would bring back, if they didn't have the documentation, they would bring back substantiation that they had been owners of that property. And then lastly, the probate records, which are for the most part, part of the East Florida papers. Those are records from the second Spanish period, but there are some first Spanish period records that have become incorporated into them. And the probate records are, of course, terrific because they have appraisals of houses. And I always think it's interesting, I'll mention one of them later on. There's an appraisal, someone who's rather well-to-do, he dies without a will, he has a wife and 5 children. Well, you know, you can see all the problems already being set up. A wife and 5 children. Everybody wants to make sure they get their equal part, and there's no will to say. So they go through an appraisal. The appraisals are very, very detailed, especially for the buildings, as to how many windows there are, what the values of the windows are, how many shingles there are, what the value of the shingles are. They are very, very, but I tend to give them a lot of credence because you've got 6 people here all trying to get their fair share. So even if they couldn't read, you know they found somebody to read and say, okay, what's this worth? Because I don't want my brother to get more than I do. Or maybe he does, you know, that's just human nature. So I think the probate records give us a lot of valuable information. And so that's sort of the list that I go down. And as I said, it's never a perfect world, and there's more frustration than there are discoveries. All right, let's see. This is the Puente map that I mentioned, the Vigia de la Puente map, in color here. Once again, here's the buildings that we're looking at. And then the full map, which is only in black and white, which has the listing of all the people's houses in St. Augustine. Their names over here. I know it's too far back for you to read it. Their names are over here. The north-south measurement, the east-west measurement, and then these, of course, are the block names. And so we have a rough idea of what their property was like. Now, as I said, he was not a surveyor. He was not an engineer. He was going to serve as the real estate agent for the people that were going to Cuba that had not been able to sell their houses before they left. So he's making a quick list. And so he would not do something like the Roque map of about 24 years later, where Roque is an engineer. He has plenty of time to do the surveying, and you can see the lot lines are uneven. Here's a lot line here. It looks kind of like the state of Utah. You know, he includes all the extra little buildings. We don't get that type of information out of the Vigia de la Puente map because he didn't have the time, and that really was what he was interested in. He wanted to know who owned it, about how big it was, and see if he could get some money for them by selling it to the British. Also, I mentioned some of the records that I was using, just to show you some things. This is a baptism record from 1703. This is holes in the paper. That's what that brown is. Off to the side, you can see that they would list the name of the person. This is at the top is Francisco Amulato, and then it's his baptismal certificate in 1703. Today, these are available online. You generally cannot go down to the diocese to work on them. They will let you, but you have to have a good reason to want to actually look at the originals. But when I first started working on these, this is what I worked with. This is negative microfilm. And the parish records were microfilmed first. And then, I guess to save money, I'm not quite sure why, but most of the time the microfilm was negative. You could get a positive copy, but you dealt with a negative copy, and you can imagine it's quite difficult. And the white, you don't know sometimes whether it's ink or whether it's a hole. So it is difficult. So I'm looking, using all of this, I'm looking to find the families that De La Puente lists on his map in the Tovar house and in the Gonzalez house. What I found as I started to do the work was not what I was expecting to find, and that is that the people that, you probably figured it out by now, the people that lived in the Tovar house and the people that lived in the Gonzalez house, or the oldest house, had the same grandparents and great-grandparents. I was not looking for that, I was not expecting to find them. We needed to know who lived in the Tovar house, so we had some idea when perhaps there was a change of ownership, perhaps because of marriage or something, some way to try to match or mesh the archaeological information, the architectural information with the documentary information. It's not, as you can tell, it's obviously not a perfect science. But anyway, I found out that Juan Dominguez de Viana and Dominga de Ares y Rodriguez, also known as Echeverria, married in 1661. Parish records have, and you will find any combination of these names usually in the parish records, but not always consistently. So he might be Juan de Viana or Juan Dominguez or something like that. I think some of it is, I'm not sure the priest always asked everybody for the information. And the people that he asked a lot of the time probably couldn't read, or they never saw the information. So I'm not saying it's all wrong, but you can see the possibilities for slippage here. Fortunately, Spanish women kept their own names, which makes it much easier when you're trying to find people. And I think for her, she was probably glad she did, because you know what? She'd have been known as Dominga Dominguez otherwise. So on that one, she must have said. In 1661, they were married. This is 10 years, about 10 years before the building of the Castillo, and about 20-odd years before we really start to see new soldiers being sent to St. Augustine. We don't know where Juan Dominguez was from. He probably was from St. Augustine. The parish records don't say. It doesn't say where either of them were from. And I think a lot of times in these earlier records, it doesn't say where they were from, because probably so many of them were from St. Augustine that they didn't bother to write it. But I don't want to try to read the minds of people from that long ago, because I don't do a very good job of reading the minds of the people that I see every day. And so we take the information. What I did was I took this part of the Puente map. These are the 4 houses that I've been showing you, and then went backwards with the names to try to find out how far back I could go. And that's how I found out that the Dominguez family lived there. Okay, so the Dominguez and the Dominguez couple seems like they got a fairly large piece of property. If you look, this red line is about what I think was the initial piece of property that they had, and they were able, obviously, to divide it several times. So their daughter, Maria, married in 1686 to a man from Puebla de los Angeles in Mexico, just generally known as Puebla. He was Nicolas Tovar, and then 9 years later, their younger daughter, Josefa, married a man named Juan de Vara, and they would live in the oldest house location. I think it's easier if I put it this way for you all to see. So there's the 2 daughters. Juan Manuel Laguna de Guevara, his name appears in all sorts of combinations, and it can be rather confusing. Now, what I think is the Tovar house obviously stays in the Tovar family from the marriage here in 1686 until they leave for Cuba, 70, 80 odd years later. Because the Tovar name, or that's what it seems to, there's never anything definite here, because we don't have the deeds from this time period, so we have to infer a lot of things. So it seems to stay in the Tovar family, obviously the Tovar boys or the Tovar men, the successive generations. But over at the oldest house, the Gonzalez Alvarez house, that seems to pass from mother to daughter to granddaughter. And that is a dowry situation, which I've done a lot of research on for St. Augustine. Dowries, very quickly in the Spanish world, were something provided to a woman as she was about to marry. It made her obviously much more marriageable. They could be many things. In St. Augustine, they were very often homes. They were houses or home sites. But typically, dowries were not houses. They were jewelry, fine clothing, horses, slaves, usually not property. And even in the 16th century, really not public offices, but royal offices. You could buy an office for enough money, and actually for several lifetimes. So you could give your daughter a public office, and then of course her husband could fill it, and he would be able to support the family. The main idea is that a woman was in a weaker social position than men at this time. I think that's pretty true. And the dowry was supposed to keep them from being dependent on either largesse or the church or some sort of poor provisions. And so they would have something that they could sell or mortgage. In this case, they had a house. And it's a perfect thing for St. Augustine because in the 1680s, we start to see a whole lot of new soldiers coming in from someplace else. And if there's one thing you can't take with you someplace else, it's land. And so we have a lot of landless men coming into St. Augustine, and these women can provide houses and make them attractive, more attractive to marry than they might have been otherwise. The dowry is it is a real protection for the weaker members of society, because the dowry belonged to the woman, but her husband could use it during his lifetime, or use the income from it. So she couldn't do it. It's almost like, remember with Downton Abbey and an entailed estate? It's not the same thing, but it's that same idea. You can use it, but you don't really own it. When he died, that freed up the dowry, and it was then hers to do as she wished, possibly in St. Augustine find another husband with the same house again. If she died before him, the dowry ultimately went to her children, not to her husband. He could use it to raise the children, but when he died or when he moved out, it went back to the children. And we do see this in wills over and over, where people explain how they got houses. The elderly men do, how they got houses and why they still have them, and they probably should have gone back to a previous owner. So it appears that the oldest house was part of this dowry system. And as I said, men of advanced age who had outlived several wives, and that was very common at that time, and many of their own children required detailed explanations to substantiate why they might own some of these dowry properties long after their wives had died. The colony's longtime treasurer, Francisco Menendez Marquez, said in his will about the practice, he said that when his daughters married, he provided houses at the time of the marriage for the first two. He'd run out of property for the next three, and so he gave them other things: slaves, horses, and earrings. Then he goes on to explain about the houses that the wives brought into the marriage. The wives had come into the marriage with houses. His second wife, he said, brought into the marriage a two-story house that was her maternal legacy, probably a dowry from her own mother, which she willed to him because the two of them had no children, so she just willed it to him. There was no children to take care of. And then Menendez's father-in-law, because he would have usually had that dowry, had to agree that Menendez could have it. And so it goes on like this. I'm not going to continue on with this. So that's the situation that I think that existed for the Gonzalez family. So what I think is that the Tovar family, after they got married, after the oldest girl, Maria, got married, they either built or maybe lived in an already existing house there. And I think that Josefa Dominguez lived in the oldest house and possibly with her parents. That her parents may have continued to live there. In other words, a multi-generation household. Let's bring into this some of the things we found out for about this same time period from the excavations. Quoting Herschel and Kathy, and I'm not sure who's quoting who here, so that's why I'm saying I'm quoting both of them, because I think Herschel is quoting Kathy or Kathy is quoting Herschel. Excavations revealed a pre-Tovar house, 17th century occupation of the site, but the excavations were too limited to reveal more specific information. The second stage excavations revealed construction of a masonry house on a wide, well-consolidated marine shell and mortar footing during the latter part of the 1600s or around the turn of the 1700s. And the documentary information meshes with this and also other things that are going on at the time. One of the things that was going on about 1690, or the latter part of the 1600s, to use Shepard's words, was that the governor of Florida released coquina from the royal quarries to be used in private construction. It had not been available for private construction while the heavy quarrying was going on for the Castillo. They were always worried that the quarry was going to be depleted, and we see this in the 1600s and we see this later in the 1800s, and they do have to start opening up new quarries, but they're always worried that they're going to run out of stone for defense reasons. But in the 1690s, the governor starts to make the coquina available to private citizens. Now, he'd already had a problem with one of the local officials who just decided he was just going to go over there and take the coquina out of the quarry himself. And there's all these appeals to the king and everything else, and people complain about what he's taking. So he wasn't the first person to try to do private destruction with royal coquina, but it wasn't permitted. And of course, as the work for the Castillo is starting to wind down, there's probably a cadre of craftsmen who have been trained to work with the shelf stone, and they might be looking for work. And there was easy credit for the soldiers to get the coquina. They could buy it by using their soldiers' salary. Royal policy permitted soldiers to pledge their salaries to finance the coquina for their new structures. And although the Governor Quiroga, wrote in 1690 that he gave unfinished stone a ripio and lime to some persons, he didn't really mean gave at no cost. I think he just turned it over. Because, to quote the document, each person was charged against their salary for the material. And thus the soldiers drew against their pay from the crown for the coquina. Coquina which cost the crown nothing and was merely dug from the quarries on crown land. In May of 1691, Joaquin de Florencia reported that he was selling lime and stone from the royal quarries, and that for the past 11 months, since June of 1690, he had sold 691 bushels of lime and 114 raft loads of ripio, which is unfinished coquina. I don't want to say rubble because that makes it sound like it's too much of the detritus. And that each person was charged against the situado. Now, as for credit, you know, I don't think at this time, I've often thought, I haven't been able to prove this yet, but I don't think the crown at this time was giving the soldiers an advance on their salary by letting them have this coquina, because the soldiers' pay was way behind. And so actually, they were trying to pay off back pay due the soldiers by selling them this coquina and pulling down the debt. And of course, when the money arrived, almost always, it just was sometimes very late. I mean, really late. And so they could charge that against the back pay. And they did this with the coquina, and they did that with other things, with things that came into the crown possession, seized goods and things like that. And given some of the other auctions at which they sold things and charged them against the soldiers' salaries, I think they probably charged a pretty high price for things because they wanted to work down that money that was owed the soldiers. So perhaps the Dominguez couple was able to take advantage of the available of the coquina. We know that in 1698 the crown owed Corporal Juan Dominguez several years' pay, and he held 2 soldiers' positions. I don't know how he did it, but he was paid 2 soldiers' salaries. So he must have had quite a bit due him. We might ask, did Juan Dominguez and his son-in-law, who didn't have all that back money owed him, did they use their soldiers' salaries to buy coquina to make the houses? Was this the source of the construction of the masonry house at the Tovar site on the wide, well-consolidated marine shell that Shepard talks about? In 1702, the Dominguezes, their children and grandchildren, probably would have left their homes on what is now the St. Augustine Historical Society property to sequester themselves in the Castillo during the siege by the English. The English invaders, remember, from Carolina made their headquarters during the siege at the Franciscan monastery, right across the street from the oldest house in the Tovar house. And we might wonder if the soldiers, or they were soldiers, the English invaders, helped themselves to those houses as well, or what might have been in there. They were right across the street. And perhaps they pilfered some of the homes or took up quarters in there. As you all remember, when the English left, they burned most of the town in anger, and St. Augustine was left without many buildings standing, or at least not complete buildings standing. Florida officials compiled a list of properties of St. Augustine residents that were damaged or destroyed during the invasion. The appraisal of the destruction hopefully would serve as substantiation for a request for royal compensation for the losses, so that there would be some sort of repayment. Known as the 1709 Ruined House List, the compilation is divided into 2 main categories. Let's see if I can get this. Oops. There's the quarries again. Okay, into 2 main categories. There is a list of 31 buildings which lay within a musket shot of the Castillo, and they were burned by the Spanish. so that they could not provide a place for, the musket shot goes both ways. If you can shoot out from the bastion of the Castillo and a musket shot, like they can shoot back in that direction. And so they didn't want to provide cover or a place for people to shoot into the Castillo from the houses that were close by. There were 31 of those, and that was one list. And there's the approximate 750 feet. That's the area in which most of those houses would have lain. The rest of the city, obviously, would be on the other list. And the list of the 31 houses destroyed at the order of the Spanish governor is more detailed than the list of the people whose houses were burned by the English. It may have been that there was a better chance of them being reimbursed since the Spanish did the destruction. And it does list materials and some other things like that. All the rest of the city, it doesn't list materials. The Dominguez is on that list, and Tovar is on that list, but it only has a value. So we don't know what their houses were made of in 1702 or 1700 because the list just isn't given. The property of Nicholas Tovar was valued at 400 pesos, which was a little bit above the mean in the town, and I think the other one was valued at about 350. Now, Herschel Shepard has identified a third phase of construction in the Tovar house, and quoting his report, he says, there was a tabby wall constructed along the original north footing at some time after the assumed 17th century original construction and before the British period, probably as a result of damage inflicted during the siege. Probably the builders were either Nicolas or his son. In one of the few documents from First Spanish period that describe a private building in detail that matches this, it comes from the probate, those probates that I mentioned in the East Florida papers of Diego de Espinosa. I'm just going to catch myself up here. Okay. All right. And that is when Espinosa died, he left no will, there was an appraisal, I talked all about that. He had 3 buildings on his property, and one of them on the east side of the property up near the bayfront was composed of tabby and also of hewn stone, 2 of them together, or perhaps ripio. So we have a combination of local materials in this one wall. There's 3 walls that are all made out of the same, and the 4th wall on the east side, on the water side, is made out of, I think, possibly a repair. Especially since it's on the water side, perhaps it was damaged in a storm or something like that. But we do find this evidence of buildings being made out of more than, the stone buildings being made out of more than one type of material. Now in 1709, the next Tovar Sundown married, and the corner property passed to him at some point. 6 years later, his cousin, Josefa, who grew up in the oldest house, married a man from the island of Tenerife in the Canary Islands. She married Luis Gonzalez. And her mother gave her, or I'm assuming her mother gave her as part of, from her dowry property, a place to build a house, if there wasn't already a house, on the east side of what is today the oldest house. We've paid hardly any attention to this building, this contemporary building that was also on the property, because it's not there today. It doesn't do anything to get our attention. But there was still another house on the water side, towards the water, on the east side of the property. And so without the physical remnant, we've overlooked it. But Puente lists it in his property as belonging to the heirs of Gregorio Gonzalez. Gregorio was the son of this couple, and he had died just before Puente made his map. 4 years after this couple married, Francisca Guevara marries Tomas Gonzalez Hernandez, also from the Canary Islands. Yes, they both have the last name Gonzalez, but they do not seem to have the same parents. I'm not saying they're not related, but that's all I can tell you. out of the parish records. As I mentioned earlier, she was 4 months pregnant when she married Tomas Gonzalez, and perhaps I think the couple lived with her parents because maybe they had little time to prepare, maybe they weren't planning on getting married and suddenly found out they had to. Anyway, I believe that they moved in with her parents, with the Guevaras, and they never moved out. It sounds like the what they call the kids that come home to stay and never leave again. Well, they never moved out, that is, until the Spanish moved out of St. Augustine, and then they all moved out. And they were living there in 1727 when their unnamed infant son was buried. And there's an entry in the parish records for that. And that is what we generally use. We have used up until now, maybe we'll continue, as the date by when we know that the oldest house was in place, by August of 1727. This is his birth record is at the top. It's pretty battered, as you can see. The top of the page usually gets kind of beat up because people grab it. But this is the enlargement, and if you were to read it, which I did, I'm going to explain this. Historians use this document to establish the date of the oldest house. Jean Waterbury writes that the burial entry noticed that Tomas, the father, lives near the convent. Tomas Gonzalez lives near the convent. But if you read the document itself, you will see that it says that they buried the son of Tomas Gonzalez Hernandez, married to the daughter of Juan Manuel, that man with the long name that I said, Juan Manuel Guevara. The daughter of Juan Manuel lives next to the monastery. The question is, who lives next to the monastery? The father or the grandfather, or all of them? You cannot tell from the document. It's not in plural. But right here it says, vive junto al convento de San Francisco. And so it establishes they're there, and that's why I think that one of the reasons I think they were still living with their parents. It was a multi-generational household, and now it was a three-generational household because, of course, Gonzalez and his wife had children. The wife of Tomas's mother-in-law was still alive in 1727, and it's very likely that it was her dowry property and that her husband held it as his use during his lifetime, which would revert to her or her children upon his death. Actually, Guevara's wife, Josefa Dominguez, lived to be 87 years old. So, and she died just a few years before the British takeover. So the dowry interest at that time may have passed to her daughter Francisca and available to her husband. But by then they had been living in the house for 30-odd years. So you can see these multiple generations living in this house. So let me recap here, and as to how it influences our view of the Tovar house. We've been able to follow 4 generations of a family in St. Augustine, or families if you count each generation as a family. Were they typical? I think they were. I think they were typical. I just think we don't have enough information about most of the people because of the lack of deeds, the lack of wills and things like that. It's hard to trace people back. It's hard to trace people back and put them in a location. Here we were fortunate because, for whatever reason, the Tovar family kept it in the mail line, so that was easy, real easy to accept. And I'm not saying that's exceptional. Not every house was a dowry. And then we have, for some reason, this unusual entry at the burial of the infant as to where the family lives, which of course meshes with the Eligio de la Puente map. I can't figure out why Juan Manuel, the grandfather, had this interesting little item thrown in there that he lived next to the convent. The burial records hardly ever tell where anybody lives, and especially not for an unnamed infant. And then it makes you really wonder about this family, if there's even something cosmic about them. Because when his wife dies, the one who's 87, it says in the burial record, she's 87 years old. They don't give the age of people in burial records, or hardly ever give the age of burials hardly ever give the age of the deceased in the burial records. Why did this family, not the same priest, it's years apart, not the same priest, why? It's just coincidence? Probably so, but it does make you wonder why this family would have those exceptional little comments when most other people don't. So were they typical? I think they were fairly typical. And as I said, I have other examples of families that passed property down through successive female generations. They were in a different part of the city. So those 4 generations span about a century, from that marriage in 1661 until the evacuation in 1763 in St. Augustine. And these dowry properties were considered an advance inheritance. It was an inheritance that people often expected to get. And in our time today, we might call this that this was a transfer of wealth made while the person was still alive. So by combining archaeological information, the analysis of building practices, and the documentary records in a very imperfect way, I might say, it seems we can say that Nicolas Tovar from Puebla occupied and maybe built the masonry building at the corner. How much of it survived the 1702 siege? We aren't sure. Well, it looks like perhaps a good bit of it did, and Kathy's shaking her head. Nicholas, no doubt, came to Florida as part of the strengthening of the troops and the defense that was going on in St. Augustine and around the rest of the Spanish Caribbean in response to pressure from English incursions throughout the Atlantic coast. Nicolas was the grandfather of Jose de Tovar, the person who is listed on the Eligio de la Puente map. And so we wrapped it all up nicely in a bow, and they all got to see that drama across the street. Thank you.